London, May 1852, the last ball of the season. Margaret Eleanor Ashford had long since stopped expecting invitations to dance. At 40 years old, she existed in that peculiar social limbo reserved for unmarried women who had outlived their usefulness. Not quite a spinster aunt, not quite a servant, she occupied the shadowy spaces of her sister's household at Thornfield Manor, serving as unpaid governess to her nephews and nieces and companion to the Viscountess Caroline Ashford when propriety demanded another lady's presence. Tonight, propriety demanded her attendance at the Haverford Ball in Grosvenor Square. Caroline required a chaperone for her daughters, and Margaret, as always, complied. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and ambition. Hundreds of candles illuminated silk gowns and jewelled throats, casting dancing shadows across walls hung with gilt-framed mirrors. Margaret stood near a potted palm, a position she had perfected over 2 decades of such events, visible enough to fulfill her duty, invisible enough to avoid notice. She had nearly succeeded in fading into the wallpaper when their voices carried across the marble floor. "Is that the Ashford spinster?" Lady Arabella's voice, honeyed with cruelty, cut through the orchestral waltz. "Good heavens, she must be 40 if she's a day." 42, I heard. Another debutante replied, her laugh like breaking glass. Can you imagine? Still attending balls at such an age. Margaret's fingers tightened on her reticule. She should move away. She had perfected the art of not hearing, not feeling, not mattering. But her feet remained planted, as if some perverse part of her needed to hear exactly how thoroughly she had failed at being a woman. "Do you suppose she still has hope?" Arabella continued. "Or has she finally accepted that no man will ever want her? I don't know which would be sadder, hope or resignation." The young women dissolved into giggles, their pristine white gowns swaying as they moved away, leaving Margaret standing alone beside her palm tree, their words settling over her like ash. She had grown accustomed to invisibility. What she had not grown accustomed to was the casual cruelty that occasionally pierced that invisibility, reminding her that she was seen just enough to be pitied, mocked, dismissed. Across the ballroom, Caroline caught her eye. Margaret's younger sister stood surrounded by admirers, her beauty still remarkable at 36, her position as Viscountess secure. For a moment, their gazes held. Margaret waited for some sign of sisterly sympathy, some acknowledgement of the humiliation she had just endured. Caroline's lips curved in the smallest of smiles. Then she turned back to her companions, leaving Margaret with the unmistakable understanding that her sister had heard every word, and agreed with the assessment. The walls of the ballroom seemed to press inward. Margaret needed air, needed escape, needed to be anywhere but here, visible only, long enough to be ridiculed, and then forgotten again. She slipped from the ballroom with the ease of long practice, her movements so unremarkable that not a single head turned to mark her departure. The corridor beyond was blessedly cool and empty. She found the library by instinct, drawn to books as she had always been. They, at least, never judged her for existing. The library was dark, illuminated only by moonlight streaming through tall windows. Margaret closed the door behind her and leaned against it, allowing herself one moment of weakness. Not tears. She had stopped crying years ago. Just a moment to breathe, to remember that she had survived worse than the casual cruelty of debutantes, that she would survive this, too. She moved to the nearest shelf and selected a volume at random. Philosophy. Perfect. She settled into a leather chair near the window and opened the book, letting the familiar comfort of words wash over her. She was 3 pages into a particularly dense passage about the nature of human dignity when the door opened. Margaret looked up, expecting a servant or perhaps another refugee from the ballroom's social warfare. Instead, she found herself looking at a man she did not recognize. tall, perhaps mid-40s, with dark hair silvering at the temples and eyes that seemed to see more than she wished to reveal. His clothing marked him as aristocracy of the highest order. The cut of his coat, the quiet richness of his waistcoat, the way he carried himself. This was a man accustomed to deference. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice low and surprisingly warm. "I did not expect to find anyone here." "Nor did I," Margaret replied, marking her page with one finger. "I can leave if you prefer solitude." "Please don't." He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. "I came seeking escape from the tedium of enforced sociability. It seems you had the same inclination." There was something in his tone, a weariness that echoed her own, that made Margaret relax slightly. "The ballroom does rather demand endurance." "Indeed." He moved closer, and moonlight illuminated his features more clearly. Strong jaw, intelligent eyes, a mouth that looked as though it rarely smiled, but might be devastating when it did. "What are you reading?" Margaret glanced down at the book. Spinoza. Ethics. His eyebrows rose. Light entertainment for a ball. "I find his thoughts on human freedom more engaging than watching young people dance." A smile ghosted across his lips. "You don't dance, miss?" "Ashford," Margaret supplied. "And no, Your Grace, no one has asked me to dance in years." She saw the moment he registered the title, the slight widening of his eyes, the infinitesimal straightening of his posture. So he was a duke. She should probably be more deferential, more careful. But exhaustion had stripped away her capacity for performance. "I see," he said slowly, studying her with new interest. "And you're content with that arrangement?" "Content is perhaps too strong a word. Resigned would be more accurate." Margaret met his gaze directly. "I suspect you understand something of resignation, Your Grace. You're hiding in a library at the season's most important ball." For a moment she wondered if she had overstepped. Then he laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his entire countenance. "Sebastian Thorne," he said, offering a slight bow, "Duke of Ashbourne. And you're quite right, Miss Ashford. I am indeed hiding." "From whom?" "From everyone attempting to thrust their daughters, nieces, or wards into my path. Apparently, 3 years of widowhood is quite sufficient time to begin hunting for a new Duchess." There was bitterness beneath his words, a pain that resonated with Margaret's own. She closed her book. "Then I won't keep you from your solitude, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he corrected, "and I find I prefer your company to solitude. You're the first person in months who hasn't treated me as a title with a fortune attached." Margaret felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or simply the unfamiliar sensation of being seen as something other than a failure. "That's because I'm invisible, Your Grace. It's rather liberating. When no one expects anything from you, you're free to be honest." Sebastian regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Invisible," he repeated softly. "I don't think that's quite accurate, Miss Ashford." Before she could respond, voices in the corridor announced the approach of other guests. The private spell of the library shattered. "I should return," Margaret said, rising. "My sister will wonder where I've gone." "Will she?" The question held a note of skepticism that suggested he understood more than she had revealed. Margaret moved toward the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. "Thank you, Your Grace, for the conversation." "Sebastian," he reminded her again. "And it is I who should thank you. You've given me something I haven't had in a very long time." "What's that?" "An honest conversation." His eyes held hers. "I wonder, Miss Ashford, if I might call on you. To continue our discussion of Spinoza, of course." Margaret's heart performed a treacherous leap. "I don't think that would be wise, Your Grace." "Probably not," he agreed, "but I find myself caring less about wisdom than I once did." She fled then, back to the ballroom and the safety of invisibility, telling herself that dukes did not call on 40-year-old spinsters, that the encounter had meant nothing, that the warmth in her chest would fade by morning. But 3 days later, when the Duke of Ashbourne's card was delivered to Thornfield Manor requesting permission to call, Margaret discovered that some things, some dangerous, impossible things, refused to fade at all. Caroline held the calling card between 2 fingers as though it were a dead mouse. "The Duke of Ashbourne wishes to call. On Thursday. For tea." Margaret's hand stilled over the embroidery she had been pretending to work on. They were in the drawing-room at Thornfield Manor, sunlight streaming through windows overlooking the estate's manicured gardens. Caroline's 2 eldest daughters, Isabella and Sophia, looked up from their watercolours with sudden interest. "How extraordinary," Caroline continued, her voice sharp with calculation. "I cannot imagine what would bring a duke to our modest home unless—" Her gaze fixed on Margaret with predatory intensity. "You didn't speak to him at the Haverford ball, did you?" "Briefly," Margaret admitted, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "In the library." "The library?" Caroline's laugh held no warmth. "Of course. Well, whatever you said, it appears to have made an impression. Isabella, Sophia, we must prepare. A duke calling. This is an opportunity we cannot squander." Margaret watched her sister transform into a general marshalling troops. Instructions flew to servants about refreshments, about which rooms to open, about ensuring every surface gleamed. Isabella and Sophia were sent to try on their finest day dresses. Caroline herself disappeared into her wardrobe, emerging an hour later in a gown of pale blue silk that accentuated her still remarkable figure. No one asked Margaret what she planned to wear. No one suggested she might prepare. She was, after all, merely the spinster aunt who happened to have exchanged a few words with a duke. Invisible, as always, except when needed to pour tea or fetch shawls. Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth. By 3 o'clock the drawing-room resembled a stage set. Flowers arranged, just so, the finest china laid out, Caroline and her daughters positioned in carefully orchestrated casual elegance. Margaret, in her usual grey day dress, was relegated to the role she knew best, servant masquerading as family. When the Duke of Ashbourne was announced, Caroline rose with practised grace, her smile dazzling. "Your Grace, what an honour. Please do sit. Margaret, pour the tea." Sebastian, though Margaret forced herself to think of him as the Duke now, entered the room with that same air of contained power she remembered from the library. His eyes swept the scene, taking in Caroline's elaborate preparations, the daughters positioned like flowers in a garden, and Margaret in the corner with the tea service. Something flickered across his face. Disappointment, perhaps, or understanding. "Lady Ashford," he said, bowing correctly to Caroline. "Thank you for receiving me. Miss Isabella, Miss Sophia." He acknowledged the girls with perfect courtesy, then turned to Margaret. "Miss Ashford, it's a pleasure to see you again." The way he said it, with genuine warmth, as though she were the person he had come to see, sent colour flooding to Margaret's cheeks. Caroline's smile sharpened. "How kind of you to remember my sister. Margaret, the tea, please. His Grace must be parched from his journey." Margaret moved to pour, her hands steady despite the chaos in her chest. She had told herself not to hope, not to imagine that the library conversation had meant anything. Yet here he sat, watching her with those intelligent eyes while Caroline chattered about the weather and the season and her daughter's various accomplishments. "Isabella plays the pianoforte beautifully," Caroline was saying, "and Sophia's watercolours have been much admired. They are both accomplished young women, Your Grace, quite ready for society. I'm sure they are, Sebastian replied politely, accepting his teacup from Margaret. Their fingers brushed, sending electricity up her arm. Tell me, Miss Ashford, did you finish the Spinoza? The room fell silent. Caroline's expression froze somewhere between confusion and displeasure. I did, Your Grace, Margaret said quietly. His thoughts on freedom proved even more interesting than I anticipated. And what did you conclude? Do you agree with his assertion that freedom lies in understanding necessity? Margaret felt Caroline's glare like a physical weight, but Sebastian's attention was focused entirely on her, genuinely waiting for her answer. When had anyone last waited for her thoughts on anything more consequential than whether cook should prepare lamb or beef? I think, she said carefully, that understanding necessity doesn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it simply feels like resignation. Sebastian leaned forward slightly, his teacup forgotten. But isn't resignation itself a form of bondage? A surrender to circumstances that might be changed? Not if the circumstances are truly immutable, Your Grace. If society has certain fixed rules, understanding them doesn't grant power to change them. It merely allows one to navigate them with less pain. Society's rules, he said softly, are only as fixed as we allow them to be. Your Grace, Caroline interrupted, her voice bright and brittle. Perhaps you would enjoy a tour of our gardens. Isabella has cultivated a remarkable rose garden. So accomplished in horticulture, my eldest daughter. Sebastian set down his teacup with deliberate care. That sounds delightful, Lady Ashford. Miss Ashford. He looked at Margaret. Would you join us? I find I have more questions about Spinoza. Caroline's mouth opened, then closed. Social convention trapped her neatly. She could not refuse a duke's direct request without unforgivable rudeness. Of course. Margaret, do accompany his grace. Isabella, Sophia, come along. The garden party progressed as an exercise in barely concealed tension. Caroline maneuvered repeatedly to place Isabella at Sebastian's side, to showcase Sophia's knowledge of Latin plant names, to remind the Duke of her daughter's youth and beauty and eligibility. Sebastian remained polite, but distant with the girls, continuing instead to direct his conversation to Margaret. They discussed philosophy, literature, the peculiar isolation of being fundamentally misunderstood by society. With each passing minute, Margaret felt the dangerous warmth in her chest grow stronger, even as Caroline's displeasure became palpable. When they reached the far end of the garden, away from the house and Caroline's watchful presence, Sebastian slowed his pace until Margaret found herself walking alone with him among the roses. I must confess, he said quietly, that wasn't entirely honest. Margaret's heart sank. What wasn't, Your Grace? My interest in your sister's garden. I called today because I wanted to see you again, Miss Ashford. The library conversation has occupied my thoughts these past 3 days in a way I can't quite explain. Your Grace, Sebastian, he corrected gently. Please, when we speak, I want to be a man, not a title. That's not possible, Margaret said, though her voice trembled. You are a duke. I am a woman who treats me as though I'm human. He finished. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How exhausting it becomes, being treated as a walking fortune and a title? You looked at me in that library and saw a man hiding from tedium, not the Duke of Ashbourne. That's because I'm invisible, Margaret said, the words escaping before she could stop them. No one expects anything from me anymore. I haven't had to perform in years. Then you understand, Sebastian said, and something in his voice made her look up. His expression held a vulnerability she recognized because she had felt it herself, the weariness of pretending, of meeting expectations, of never being seen for what you truly were. You understand what it is to be invisible even when surrounded by people. Yes, Margaret whispered. Yes, I understand that. They stood among the roses, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, and for a moment the world contracted to just this. Two people who had learned to survive by hiding, finding each other in the wreckage of their respective solitudes. May I call again? Sebastian asked. Every ounce of sense Margaret possessed screamed that she should refuse, should protect herself from the inevitable pain when he grew bored or remembered that 40-year-old spinsters were not suitable companions for dukes. But sense had never brought her anything except survival, and she was suddenly desperately tired of merely surviving. Yes, she said. You may. His smile transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the man beneath the title. Then I shall see you soon, Margaret. The use of her Christian name sent warmth flooding through her, dangerous and intoxicating. She watched him return to the house, watched Caroline intercept him with forced cheerfulness, watched him take his leave with perfect courtesy. That evening, Caroline cornered her in the morning room. I don't know what game you're playing, her sister hissed, but it ends now. The Duke was clearly being polite out of pity. Don't embarrass yourself by imagining anything more. Margaret met her sister's furious gaze with unexpected calm. I imagine nothing, Caroline. The Duke asked permission to call. I granted it. He'll tire of your pretensions to intelligence. Men of his station want beauty and youth, not aging spinsters with books. The words landed like stones, but Margaret had learned long ago how to bear such blows. She said nothing, merely turned back to her needlework, and after a moment Caroline left, her silk skirts rustling with indignation. But Margaret's hands shook as she set down her embroidery. Because Caroline was right, wasn't she? Dukes didn't fall in love with women like her. This was pity or eccentricity, and when Sebastian realized that truth, the end would be devastating. Yet when his card arrived 3 days later, requesting permission to call again, Margaret found herself unable to refuse the dangerous temptation of hoping. The second visit came on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was in the stables with her nephew James, a gangly 16-year-old who had sought her help with his horse's thrown shoe. She had removed her gloves and was examining the gelding's hoof when Sebastian's voice came from the stable entrance. Miss Ashford, I hope I'm not interrupting. Margaret straightened quickly, suddenly aware of her dishevelled state. Hair escaping its pins, dress dusty, hands decidedly not those of a lady at leisure. Your Grace, I wasn't expecting. That is, we weren't informed. I should have sent word. Sebastian admitted, moving into the stable. But I was riding nearby and thought I might chance an informal call. His eyes took in the scene with interest. You're skilled with horses. Aunt Margaret knows everything about horses, James said with the easy adoration of youth. She taught me to ride. Did she? Sebastian smiled at the boy. Then you're fortunate in your teacher, young man. James beamed, and Margaret felt a rush of affection for her nephew, the only member of her family who treated her with genuine respect. The shoe just needs resetting, Margaret said, lowering the hoof gently. James, why don't you take Brutus to Cooper? He'll have the smithy tend to it properly. Yes, Aunt Margaret. James led the horse away, leaving them alone in the quiet dimness of the stable. Sebastian studied her with that unsettling intensity she remembered from the library. Your nephew clearly adores you. James is a good boy. He deserves kindness. Margaret brushed hay from her skirt self-consciously. I apologize for my appearance. If I'd known you were coming, don't apologize. Sebastian stepped closer. I find I prefer you like this. Real, not performing. The word hung between them, freighted with meaning. Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze. Is that what this is, Your Grace? A fascination with something real after a lifetime of performance? Sebastian. He corrected again, but gently. And yes, partly. My first marriage. He stopped, jaw tightening. My first marriage was to a beautiful young woman chosen by my father. Perfect bloodlines, perfect manners, perfect face, and perfectly false in every word and gesture. I'm sorry, Margaret said quietly. She took lovers. The confession emerged raw and painful. Multiple lovers throughout our marriage. When I discovered the truth, she laughed. Said I had married her for her beauty and bloodlines, so I could hardly complain if that's all she was. Margaret drew in a sharp breath. That's cruel. That's society. Sebastian corrected bitterly. Beautiful transactions between beautiful people, all of us pretending that love and honesty matter when they don't. Not really. Not in our world. He looked at her intently. And then I met you, hiding in a library, reading philosophy, treating me as though I were simply another person seeking refuge. You asked nothing of me, expected nothing. You were just real. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was dangerous territory, far beyond casual friendship or intellectual companionship. This was something that could destroy her if she allowed herself to believe it. I've spent 40 years being invisible, she said carefully. I learned that performing for society's approval was pointless when society had already judged me a failure. So yes, I stopped performing, but that's not nobility, Your Grace, that's resignation. Then you understand, Sebastian said, moving closer still. The stable suddenly felt very small, very warm. You understand why someone who spent a lifetime being a title, a fortune, a political asset, might crave the company of someone who simply sees him as a man. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and careful. Margaret knew she should pull away, should remember her place, should protect herself from the inevitable pain. But his touch sent fire racing through her veins, waking sensations she thought had died years ago. Sebastian, she whispered, using his name for the first time. Please, don't do this if you don't mean it. His thumb traced circles on her palm. What if I mean it? What if I find myself thinking about you constantly? What if I haven't felt this connection with anyone in years, perhaps ever? Then you're deluding yourself, Margaret said, but her voice broke. I'm 40 years old. I'm the joke of London society. You could have any woman, young, beautiful, appropriate. I don't want any woman, Sebastian said fiercely. I want someone real, someone honest, someone who knows what it is to be invisible and has survived it with dignity intact. His free hand came up to cup her face. I want you, Margaret. For one breathless moment, she allowed herself to believe it, allowed herself to lean into his touch, to feel the warmth of his body close to hers, to imagine that dukes could fall in love with aging spinsters in dusty stables. Then reality crashed back. Stop, she whispered, pulling away. Please stop. I can't. Your Grace, I won't be your temporary fascination. I won't be the eccentric choice you make. To prove you're different from other aristocrats. When you tire of me, when you realize what society will say, when you remember that I'm just a failed woman who's grateful for any attention. Margaret, that's not. I have to go. She was backing toward the stable door, panic rising in her throat. Please don't call again, Your Grace. This is too cruel. She fled, leaving Sebastian standing alone among the horses, his hand still outstretched toward empty air. For 3 days, no cards arrived. Margaret told herself she was relieved. She had been right to run, right to protect herself. Whatever Sebastian had felt was clearly fleeting, a momentary interest in something novel that had already faded. She returned to her usual routines, managing household accounts Caroline couldn't be bothered with, tutoring James in Latin, serving as invisible companion at her sister's social obligations. On Thursday, Caroline announced they would host a tea for several ladies of local society. "An intimate gathering," she explained at breakfast. "Just the Viscountess Pemberley, Lady Ashton, Mrs. Fairfax, and Miss Thornbury. Margaret, you'll serve." Margaret nodded, accustomed to being relegated to servant status at such events. She arranged the drawing room, instructed cook on refreshments, and dressed in her plainest grey gown, the costume of invisibility. The ladies arrived at 3, settling into the drawing room like exotic birds, their silk dresses rustling, their jewels catching afternoon light. Margaret poured tea and offered cakes, moving silently among them, barely acknowledged. The conversation flowed around her, gossip about upcoming weddings, speculation about who would make advantageous matches, complaints about servants and tradesmen. Margaret had heard it all 1,000 times, the circular preoccupations of women whose lives consisted entirely of navigating society's rigid structure. Then Lady Ashton mentioned the Duke of Ashbourne. "I heard the most extraordinary rumour," she said, setting down her teacup. "They say the Duke has been calling on the Ashford household, multiple times." Margaret's hand trembled, nearly dropping the teapot. "Oh, yes," Caroline said smoothly. "His Grace has been most attentive. My Isabella made quite an impression on him." "How fortunate," Mrs. Fairfax cooed. "A duke for your daughter would be quite the triumph." "Though one must wonder," Lady Ashton continued delicately, "why a duke would visit so informally. Usually such attentions would be conducted through proper channels, with clear intent." Caroline's smile hardened fractionally. "I'm sure His Grace has his reasons." "Still," Lady Ashton persisted, "there's been talk. Something about the Duke showing particular interest in— Well, I hesitate to even mention it, but you know how gossip spreads." "Do enlighten us," Caroline said, her voice now edged with steel. Lady Ashton glanced at Margaret, still standing by the tea service, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They say he's been conversing extensively with your sister, the unmarried one." The room fell into the particular silence that precedes social annihilation. Margaret felt every eye turn toward her, felt the weight of their assessment and judgment. "Margaret?" Caroline's laugh was crystal and cutting. "Don't be absurd. The Duke was merely being polite. My sister serves as companion during his visits. Someone must pour the tea after all." "Of course," Lady Ashton agreed quickly. "I'm sure there's nothing to it, though one must admit it would be quite peculiar if a duke showed interest in a woman of Miss Ashford's situation." "Peculiar indeed," Caroline agreed. "Margaret, we need more cakes from the kitchen. Do fetch them." It was a dismissal, a reminder of her place. Margaret set down the teapot with hands that wanted desperately to shake, but wouldn't give Caroline the satisfaction. As she moved toward the door, Mrs. Fairfax spoke again. "Poor dear, 40 years old and still attending to others. One supposes she's given up hope of a life of her own." "One must make oneself useful somehow," Caroline said lightly. "Even spinsters have value as household help." The words were calculated, designed to wound. Margaret's hand touched the door handle as the lady's laughter followed her, light and cruel as breaking glass. She didn't go to the kitchen. Instead, she found herself in the small parlor at the back of the house, a room rarely used where she could breathe and remember that she had survived worse than this, that she was accustomed to humiliation, that this changed nothing. Except it did. Because for a few brief days she had allowed herself to imagine something different, had allowed Sebastian's attention to crack open the protective shell she'd built around her heart. And now that crack would let the pain flood in, sharper and deeper than it had been in years. She was still standing there, staring out at the gardens, when the door opened behind her. Margaret. She turned to find Sebastian in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "Your Grace," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "I came to call, as I have been trying to do for 3 days. Your sister had my cards turned away." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I was shown to the drawing room just in time to hear Lady Ashton's comments, and your sister's response." Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation. "Then you understand why I asked you not to call again. This, whatever you imagine you feel, it only brings pain." "Pain?" Sebastian's voice was low and dangerous. "The pain, Margaret, comes from watching someone I care for being treated as though she's worthless, from hearing your own sister reduce you to household help, from society's vicious insistence that a woman's only value lies in youth and marriage and perfect adherence to their arbitrary rules. That's reality," Margaret said wearily. "Fighting it won't change it." "Then, perhaps it's time to stop accepting reality as immutable." Sebastian crossed to her, his movements deliberate. "You asked me not to do this if I didn't mean it. I'm here to tell you that I mean it, Margaret. I mean every conversation, every visit, every moment I've spent discovering who you truly are beneath the invisibility society has forced upon you. Sebastian, I see you," he said fiercely. "Do you understand? I see your intelligence, your dignity, your strength. I see the way you've survived years of casual cruelty without losing your capacity for kindness. I see that you read philosophy in libraries while others perform in ballrooms. I see that you teach your nephew to ride and manage your sister's accounts and pour tea at gatherings where you're treated as a servant. I see all of it, Margaret, and I want all of it." Margaret felt tears burn behind her eyes. "You say that now, but society has given me nothing but pain." Sebastian interrupted. "A marriage built on their rules nearly destroyed me. I spent years being exactly what was expected, the perfect duke, the perfect aristocrat, the perfect puppet performing on their stage. I'm done performing, Margaret. I want something real. I want you." "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I'm afraid to hope. I'm afraid you'll realize what a poor bargain you've made. I'm afraid I'll lose myself in this feeling and then be destroyed when it ends." Sebastian took her hands in his, gentle but firm. "Then be afraid with me, because I'm terrified too. Terrified that I've finally found someone genuine and won't know how to keep her. Terrified that you'll decide I'm not worth the scandal. Terrified that I'm too broken from my first marriage to deserve this second chance." Margaret looked up into his face and saw vulnerability that matched her own. Two people who had learned to survive through hiding, now choosing the risk of being seen. "I don't know how this works," she admitted. "I don't know how to be courted. I don't know what to do with these feelings." "Neither do I," Sebastian said, and smiled, that rare, transforming smile that made him look years younger. "But I'd like to discover it together, if you'll let me." In the distance, Margaret could hear Caroline's voice raised in agitation, calling for a servant. Reality waited just beyond this small parlour, ready to crush this fragile, impossible thing growing between them. But in this moment, with Sebastian's hands warm around hers and hope cracking open her chest like spring breaking through ice, Margaret chose risk over safety. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll let you." Sebastian pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead that felt like a promise. "Then prepare yourself, my dear, because I have no intention of hiding this or you. Society be damned." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they felt like freedom. Caroline's fury manifested 2 days later at breakfast. "I've received 3 letters this morning," she announced, slamming the correspondence onto the table with enough force to rattle the china. 3 different ladies, all repeating the same outrageous rumor that the Duke of Ashbourne has been calling on you, Margaret, that he showed you particular attention, that he was overheard defending you against Lady Ashton's perfectly reasonable observations. Margaret set down her teacup carefully. Across the table, James watched with worried eyes. "The Duke has called on this household, Caroline. You were present for both visits." "Don't play games with me," Caroline hissed. "You know exactly what I mean. You've been putting ideas in his head, playing the poor, pathetic spinster to win his pity. It's manipulative and desperate, and I won't have it." "Caroline, do you have any idea what scandal this causes? People are questioning why a duke would show interest in a 40-year-old failure. They're wondering if he's eccentric, or if you've somehow trapped him. It reflects poorly on this entire family." James pushed back from the table. "Mother, that's unfair. Aunt Margaret hasn't done anything wrong." "Be silent," Caroline snapped. "This doesn't concern you." "It does if you're going to speak to Aunt Margaret that way," James said, his young voice shaking but determined. "She's been nothing but kind to all of us. If the Duke sees her value, perhaps you should too." Caroline's face flushed with rage. "Go to your room. Now." James left reluctantly, casting Margaret one last supportive glance. When he was gone, Caroline turned her full attention back to her sister. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it ends today. I'm sending word to the Duke that his visits are no longer welcome, that you've been presuming on his kindness and embarrassing this family with your pretensions." "You can't do that," Margaret said quietly. "Watch me." Caroline stood, gathering her skirts. "You're a dependent in my household, Margaret. You exist here on my charity. If you cannot behave appropriately, I'll have no choice but to seek other arrangements for you." The threat was clear. Obey or be cast out entirely, left with no home and no prospects at 40 years old. Margaret felt the familiar weight of powerlessness settle over her shoulders. Years of dependence had taught her that Caroline held all the cards. She had no income of her own, no property, nowhere else to go. Her sister could destroy her with a single decision. "I understand," Margaret said, the words tasting like ash. "Good." Caroline's smile was triumphant. "Now go help cook with the accounts, and stay out of sight when the Duke's refusal arrives. I don't want him to see how desperate you've become." Margaret rose mechanically and left the breakfast room, Caroline's words echoing in her mind. This was reality, the immutable circumstances she had tried to explain to Sebastian. A spinster dependent had no agency, no choices, no ability to fight back against the cruelty of family or society. She spent the day in the kitchen wing, far from the main house, helping cook inventory supplies and plan menus. It was mindless work that left too much room for thought, for the pain of losing something she'd barely allowed herself to have. By evening, she had convinced herself it was for the best. Sebastian would receive Caroline's letter, realize the complications of pursuing someone in Margaret's position, and gracefully withdraw. Perhaps he'd feel some regret, but ultimately he'd be relieved to have escaped an entanglement that would have brought nothing but scandal. She was wrong. The following evening, Caroline announced they would attend Lord and Lady Pemberton's ball, the final grand event of the season. "Everyone who matters will be there," she said pointedly, "including the Duke of Ashbourne. We must show society that this family has not been touched by scandal. You will attend, Margaret, and you will be invisible. Is that clear?" Margaret nodded, too numb to protest. The Pemberton ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, as if trying to illuminate every corner where shadows might hide. Margaret took her usual position near a marble pillar, watching Caroline and her daughters enter the dancing with triumphant smiles. Word of Caroline's letter to the Duke had apparently spread through the upper circles. Several ladies approached Caroline with knowing nods, congratulating her on handling the situation with discretion. Margaret was invisible again, exactly as she should be. Except this time, invisibility felt like suffocation. She had been standing there perhaps an hour when whispers began rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. The Duke of Ashbourne had arrived. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed back against her pillar, praying he wouldn't see her, wouldn't approach, wouldn't make this any harder than it already was. But Sebastian's eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom with unerring accuracy. He moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through water, people parting before him, conversations stopping mid-sentence as guests registered his purposeful trajectory. He was heading directly towards her, his expression grim and determined. "Your Grace." Caroline intercepted him, her voice carrying sweetly across the marble floor. "How delightful to see you. I trust you received my correspondence." "I did, Lady Ashford." Sebastian's voice was cold enough to frost glass. "It was most illuminating regarding your character." Caroline's smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean. I simply thought it best to clarify the situation." "The situation," Sebastian interrupted, "is that you've systematically abused your sister's dependence on you to keep her powerless and miserable. That you've treated her as an unpaid servant while claiming the moral high ground of family obligation. That you've spread rumors casting her as a desperate manipulator to protect your own pride." The ballroom had gone silent. Hundreds of guests frozen in place, watching the scene unfold with horrified fascination. "Your Grace," Caroline gasped, her face pale. "You cannot possibly believe I believe what I've witnessed with my own eyes," Sebastian said, "and what I've witnessed is cruelty masquerading as propriety." He turned from Caroline as though she no longer existed and walked directly to Margaret, who stood frozen against her pillar, trembling. "Margaret," he said softly, for her ears alone. "I'm sorry, I should have done this sooner. I should have made my intentions clear from the beginning instead of allowing anyone to question them." "Sebastian, don't," Margaret whispered desperately. "Everyone is watching. You'll destroy your reputation." "My reputation has brought me nothing but misery," he said. "You, on the other hand, have brought me hope." Before she could respond, he turned to face the assembled crowd, every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian's voice carried clearly through the shocked silence, "I have an announcement to make." "Your Grace, please." Caroline tried once more to intervene, but Lady Catherine Pembroke, Margaret's old friend, stepped smoothly into her path, blocking her with a supportive smile toward Margaret. Sebastian continued as though there had been no interruption. "For 3 years I have been a widower. During that time, I have been relentlessly pursued, flattered, and manipulated by ambitious families seeking to align themselves with my title and fortune. I have been treated as a prize to be won rather than a man to be known." He paused, and Margaret saw genuine emotion flicker across his face. "Then, 3 weeks ago, I met a woman in a library who treated me as though I were simply another person seeking refuge from society's demands, who spoke to me with honesty instead of flattery, who asked nothing from me except the chance to continue reading her book in peace." Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd, though most remained silent, transfixed. "That woman," Sebastian said, his eyes finding Margaret's again, "is Miss Margaret Ashford, and in the weeks since I have discovered that she is intelligent, kind, dignified, and genuine in a world that prizes none of those qualities. I have discovered that she sees me, not my title, not my fortune, but me, and I have discovered that I am quite desperately in love with her." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Tears burned behind her eyes. "I am aware," Sebastian continued, addressing the crowd again, "that society will find this match peculiar. Miss Ashford is 40 years old and unmarried. Two facts that our shallow, cruel world treats as failures. She has no fortune, no powerful connections, no particular beauty by conventional standards." His voice hardened. "What she has is worth infinitely more. She has integrity, intelligence, and a heart that has survived years of casual cruelty without becoming cruel in return." He walked to where Margaret stood, her back still pressed against the marble pillar, and held out his hand. "Which brings me to the purpose of this rather public declaration." The ballroom held its collective breath. Sebastian knelt. The gasp that swept through the crowd was audible even to Margaret, who could hear nothing over the roaring in her ears. A duke did not kneel publicly. A duke did not humble himself before hundreds of witnesses. Yet Sebastian knelt on the polished ballroom floor, still holding his hand out to her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Miss Margaret Eleanor Ashford," he said clearly, "would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Of allowing me to spend the rest of my life proving that you were never invisible? You were simply waiting for someone worthy of seeing you." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. The entire ballroom swam before her eyes. Every person she had ever known, everyone who had dismissed her, or pitied her, or laughed at her, was watching this moment. "Sebastian," she whispered, her voice breaking, "everyone is watching." "Good," he said fiercely. "Let them watch. Let them see that I choose you, publicly and proudly. Let them know that I consider myself the fortunate one in this arrangement." His voice softened. "But more importantly, let me hear your answer, Margaret. Will you marry me?" Across the ballroom, Margaret could see Caroline's face, white with shock and fury. She could see the Countess of Ashton, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. She could see hundreds of faces registering shock, scandal, confusion. And she realized, with sudden crystalline clarity, that she didn't care. For 40 years she had allowed society's judgment to define her, had allowed their cruel assessment to become her truth, had accepted invisibility as her destiny because fighting seemed pointless. But Sebastian knelt before her, offering not pity but partnership, not charity but love. He saw her, truly saw her, and chose her anyway, chose her publicly, dramatically, in defiance of every social convention that said she was worthless. Perhaps Spinoza had been right after all. Understanding necessity didn't grant freedom. But choosing to act despite necessity, that was liberation. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice strengthening. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted, gasps, whispers, scattered applause, shocked exclamations. Sebastian rose smoothly and pulled Margaret into his arms, kissing her in full view of London's entire aristocracy. It was scandalous, it was improper, it was absolutely perfect. When they finally parted, Margaret was laughing and crying simultaneously, her heart so full it hurt. Sebastian cupped her face in his hands, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he said softly. "Thank you for taking the risk." "Thank you for seeing me," Margaret replied. Caroline pushed through the crowd, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. "This is absurd! Margaret, you cannot possibly— the scandal, our family's reputation." Sebastian turned to her with cold precision. "Lady Ashford, you treated a treasure as though it were refuse. Your loss, I assure you, is profound. Margaret will not be returning to Thornfield Manor except to collect her belongings. And should you attempt to spread any further rumors or cause her any distress, you will discover exactly how unpleasant I can make life for those who displease me." He offered his arm to Margaret. "Shall we leave this circus, my dear?" Margaret took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of this impossible thing. As they walked toward the ballroom exit, the crowd parted before them. Some faces showed disapproval, others shock, but more than a few, particularly among the older women, showed something that looked like approval, even joy. Lady Catherine Pembroke caught Margaret's hand as they passed. "I'm so happy for you, my dear," she whispered. "You deserve this." James was suddenly there too, having apparently sneaked into the ball. "Aunt Margaret." His young face was split by an enormous grin. "That was the most brilliant thing I've ever seen." "Thank you, James." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You were right, you know, about deserving kindness." "So were you," James said, then addressed Sebastian directly. "You'll take care of her, won't you, Your Grace?" "With my life," Sebastian promised. They left the ball together, stepping out into the cool London evening. Sebastian's carriage waited, but he made no move to enter it immediately. Instead, he pulled Margaret close, there on the street where anyone might see, and simply held her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Margaret thought about the question. Was she all right? She had just publicly defied every social convention, had been kissed in front of hundreds of people, had agreed to marry a duke, while her sister watched in fury, had walked out of that ballroom into an entirely different life than the one she'd lived that morning. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "and happy, and still half convinced I'm dreaming." Sebastian laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest where her head rested. "If you're dreaming, then so am I, and I have no desire to wake." "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Now," Sebastian said, pulling back to look at her. "We plan a wedding. We weather whatever scandal follows. We discover what it means to build a life with someone we actually choose, rather than someone chosen for us." He smiled. "And we read philosophy in libraries whenever society becomes too tedious to bear." Margaret laughed, despite her tears. "That sounds perfect." "It will be," Sebastian promised. "Not easy, perhaps. Not conventional, certainly. But real, Margaret. We'll have something real. Real. After 40 years of invisibility, of performance and pretense and painful resignation, Margaret was finally, impossibly, real." Sebastian handed her into the carriage, and as they pulled away from the Pemberton mansion, Margaret looked back at the glowing windows, at the ballroom where her entire life had just transformed. She had spent 40 years as society's joke, the spinster who failed at her only purpose, the invisible woman everyone pitied or dismissed. Now she would be a duchess. And the joke, she realized with fierce satisfaction, was entirely hers. Because while society had been laughing at her, she had been learning to survive with dignity intact. She had been developing intelligence, compassion, and strength. She had been becoming exactly the woman a wise duke would choose to spend his life with. The carriage turned a corner, and the ballroom disappeared from view. Margaret settled back against the seat, Sebastian's hand warm in hers, and smiled. She had won. Epilogue 1 week later. Thornfield Manor's morning room was silent except for the rustle of packing paper. Margaret folded another book carefully, placing it in the trunk Sebastian had sent. Her belongings were few: clothes, books, a few mementos. 40 years of life fit into 3 trunks with room to spare. "Aunt Margaret." She turned to find James in the doorway, his young face serious. "James, shouldn't you be at your lessons?" "Mother cancelled them. She's in her room. Hasn't come out since the ball." He stepped into the room, watching her pack. "I wanted to say goodbye properly, before you leave." Margaret's throat tightened. James was the only family member she would genuinely miss. "I'm not going far, my dear. You can visit whenever you like. Sebastian has already extended the invitation." "Will you be happy?" James asked suddenly. "With the Duke?" Margaret smiled, remembering Sebastian's visit that morning, bringing flowers, discussing wedding plans, treating her as though she were precious beyond measure. "Yes, James, I believe I will be very happy." "Good." James pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I wrote you a letter, for later, when you're settled. Just to say thank you, for being the only adult who ever treated me as though I mattered." Margaret took the envelope, tears threatening. "You've always mattered, James. Never forget that." A carriage sounded in the drive. Sebastian had arrived to escort her to his London residence, where she would stay with Lady Catherine as chaperone until the wedding in 3 weeks' time. As Margaret descended the stairs one final time, carrying her small valise, she passed the drawing room. Through the open door, she glimpsed Caroline standing at the window, watching the ducal carriage with an expression of such profound loss and rage that Margaret almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Sebastian waited at the bottom of the stairs, his face lighting when he saw her. "Ready, my love." "Ready," Margaret confirmed. He took her hand, and together they walked out of Thornfield Manor into bright morning sunlight. As the carriage pulled away, Margaret didn't look back. That life, of invisibility, of quiet suffering, of making herself smaller to fit into spaces that barely acknowledged her existence, was finished. She was 40 years old. She was about to become a duchess, and she was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she belonged. With someone who saw her,